So I'm going to, so we're going to have a panel on Neoplatonism. A very interesting panel because it will be all about the visible and invisible, the absent and the present, and we decided to have a virtual panel to emphasize the very essence of Neoplatonism. So there'll only be one person speaking physically, but the other speakers will be present neoplatonically through modern technology. So we're going to start with the with Jenny Messenger, a paper which focuses on the first autobiographical text by Kathleen Raine. So.
Yeah. Thank you. Is this okay? Yes. So I just wanted to start by thanking all of the organizers. I'm completely thrilled to be here in this incredible room, so thank you. So, how are we to make sense of Kathleen Raine's approach, the authorial moves she makes in writing about her life? In the preface to Autobiographies, the collected volume of her life writing published in 1991, Raine claims that her work tells the essential, eternal fable she was fated to live. The 3 books of autobiography indeed possess a rich, mythic aesthetic that evokes early 20th century preoccupations with ancient Greek philosophy, ritual, and culture. They stand as a work of mythopoesis, modernist mythopoesis perhaps, albeit published in the 1970s and well after modernism had reached its heights, and when the modernists had themselves become myths. Her work is also in conversation with a long history of allegoresis, or allegorical interpretation, particularly that of the Neoplatonists, who were late antique philosophers who commented on Platonic philosophy and developed a sophisticated method of allegoresis, and they applied it to Plato as well as texts like the Odyssey. So I suggest here that Raine takes an allegorical approach to autobiography, to read the text of her life, and I focus on her account of katabasis, or descent into the underworld, or in Platonic philosophy, into the world of the senses and the body. So this trope has a long history in 20th century literature. So Eliot, Pound, Yeats, later Heaney, as well as its use by Young. And Raine uses it to achieve a number of things. So her autobiographies map her spiritual journey onto the 20th century, interweaving ancient myth and ritual into her teenage years in Ilford, her time at Cambridge, her joy in France, in the Cumbrian Lake District, and in Scotland. She creates a mythopoetic topography, charting her soul's travels through a landscape that achieves the modernist vision of history pressing up against and intertwining with the present, combining Greco-Roman antiquity with modern literature, from William Blake to Malcolm Lowry and T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. Her autobiographies are an aesthetic coming-of-age story, a record of her finding her steady way to the art that would nourish her most, weaving a tapestry of threads that link her to her cultural and religious heritage that extends throughout time. In her 4th book of autobiography, India Seen Afar, she writes that the soul has an instinct, like animals, for where water is to be found. And Raine follows Blake's golden string to discover the tip of a submerged continent, leading to a vast expanse of learning. So Raine also presents her autobiographies as a contribution to the general pool of knowledge about human life, and perhaps also as an example of what the pursuit and representation of real life involves. They are perhaps a sort of guide for others looking for similar sustenance for the imagination. And they chart the ebb and flow of human freedom and consciousness. In the right environment, with access to the arts and a shared symbolic language, this consciousness can flourish, but otherwise becomes diminished. And they are also the story of how to make a life as a poet, and a tale of social mobility and class discomfort in an intensely stratified society. So reflecting on why she chose to write and publish a record of her life, Raine declares that she did so in order to understand, and by understanding to endure my life. Not my life as such, but as my individual way, insight into life itself. And her work is the result of her understanding of the purpose of literature and art. It is, she writes, a work of living, a participation in the creation and discovery of the depths and the heights of human experience. Crucially, the autobiographies are an account of how she came to her way of reading the world, and an affirmation of that approach, which is, as has already been discussed today, a mode shared by many throughout history, who are now often enfolded under the rubric of esotericism or the perennial philosophy. Thinkers and movements linked broadly by a similarity in approach that involves trusting one's intuition and inner experience, emphasizing the importance of symbolism and imagination, and a belief in a spiritual dimension that constituted true reality that went beyond the material. And in this, she followed philosophers like the Neoplatonists, who were adept at Allegoresis, and who emphasized multiple levels of meaning of a poem or myth that included the surface meaning, but went beyond a single interpretation. Raine interprets her past like a text throughout the autobiographies, sketching the contours of the underlying fable, delicately identifying compelling symbols and frequently offering several different meanings for a particular event or a recurrent image. So what did she discover when she applies this mode of Allegoresis to her life? What was the fable she lived? It takes the shape of the Platonic Katabasis, the descent into the body, and the anamnesis, remembering of the soul, drawing on the mythological descents of Greco-Roman heroes, as well as the work of Dante and Milton. Those who descend to the underworld can be willing travelers. Sometimes the descent is made for the sake of knowledge, as in the case of Odysseus and Aeneas, who question souls for information about the future. Sometimes, as in the case of Orpheus, the journeys are tasks to bring back a loved one. Probably the most famous abductee to the underworld is Persephone, who's taken by Hades to be his bride and finally tracked down by her mother Demeter. And of course, Katabasis holds a central place in mystery cults. Persephone and Demeter are at the core of the Eleusinian mysteries, while the Orphic rites to have a journey to the underworld as a central element. So, rather than keeping to the traditional boundaries of birth and death, Raine's story traces her soul's descent into the world of matter and machines, and finds further circles of hell on the outskirts of London and among the analytic intellectuals of Cambridge. There are references and allusions to the descent woven throughout the autobiographies, identifying Raine variously with the Kore or Persephone, with Orpheus, with Psyche. Eventually, she finds some form of reversion or anabasis after meeting Gavin Maxwell. That relationship and its aftermath marks the completion of the story she was fated to live. At the opening of Farewell Happy Fields, she starts her autobiography truly at the beginning, by describing a childhood dream she had of being born into the world of generation. This is her soul's katabasis, and the dream a form of anamnesis, the recollection of something her soul has learned, which she comes to recognize as such only later when she encounters philosophies of reincarnation, such as those attributed to Pythagoras and found in the work of Plato and the Neoplatonists. This opening establishes the theme that characterized her autobiography. Her place was her state, she writes, but it was only in this eternal reality. In the world of time and matter, place and state are no longer united. The world around her often only diminishes her state of mind. Raine thus reads and interprets this early dream as a privileged text, searching for the symbolic skeleton on which her life rests. Discussing W.B. Yeats's autobiography, the scholar David Herman notes that For Yeats, a good allegory is a counter-agent to fragmentation, personal, cultural, and political. A good allegory links, unifies, and imposes coherence, where before we may have only seen a heap of unrelated items, a collection of personae. I think Raine uses this allegorical mode in its unifying function, tracing the shape of our own life, joining dots, and also connecting her story to the one soul or mind. Everyone has their own individual story to live, she claims, marked by their particular circumstances, but this tale also contributes to an overarching wholeness. Every self, she writes, is a unique story, while also asking, are we not all the numberless expressions of the one self? More than just unifying her narrative, though, Allegoresis is all about a shift in perception, a different way of seeing the world. John Whitman, for example, notes that rather than straining the meaning of a text, Allegoresis is instead always pointing toward a goal that lies beyond it, is forever having to come to terms with its own provisionality. Raine's autobiographical writing proceeds in this kind of way. Things are always waiting to be revealed, be it a deeper self, motive, or meaning, in her own remaking or discovery of her story. So though Raine begins her earthly account in Babington, the village in Northumberland, had she written chronologically, she would have begun in Ilford, the commuter town in Essex, where she was born. Shaping the narrative this way, however, means that Raine can portray her journey as one of ever deeper descent. First, her soul descends into the world of matter and senses, but at least in Babington she feels an affinity for the landscape and a freedom of being similar to her discarnate self. Next, though, she moves to a spiritually worse state in the suburbs. Raine's Ilford is devoid of anything that might be good for the soul. It lacks culture, history, tradition, all the things she needs to fulfill her calling as a poet. She describes being born among a people alienated and divorced from their cultural heritage, possessing only the shallowest of roots in the land, and speaking a language impoverished by standardized terms and a lack of dialect words that underlines their severance from tradition. The language she uses to describe her neighbours in Essex is fraught with judgment. Mean is a frequently used adjective. Allegoresis here also functions as social critique. She's talking about the repression of people under respectability, insecure employment. This state may be spiritual in consequence, but she acknowledges that its cause is often social or economic, beyond the control of the sufferers. Raine notes that the mimetic quality of social assimilation and the masks people assume in Ilford, the dearth of culture and passionate feeling, is concealed by a veneer of prosperity. But this facade is pinned on only flimsily and hides an abyss. She writes, how precariously the respectability of suburban households was suspended over a chasm no one in Ilford could long forget. The suburbs have a long history of being viewed as places of cultural lack. The concept of suburbia as lacking diversity and originality is a counterpoint to the city, where new ideas and different cultures were free to coexist, where things happened and interesting people could be encountered. In Raine's hands, this trope allows her narrative of Katabasis to develop by underscoring the points of light she finds in Ilford that draw her gaze upwards and outwards. Both Farewell Happy Fields and The Land Unknown are brilliant in their depictions of the experience of discovering literature as an initiatory process in which a new universe unfolds. Raine's literary revelation is ignited by movements like British Romanticism, people like Robert Browning, the Celtic Revival. Through her relationship with the aptly named Roland, golden doors are opened for her. The visions of Greco-Roman antiquity found in the work of J.G. Fraser, Jane Harrison, and Gilbert Murray divulge an ancient world of symbol and meaning. This is the kind of culture she's excited about. Her father takes her to see Shakespeare. She's largely unmoved, but with Roland, it becomes real. They memorize lines by Browning and Shakespeare, and these almost become their own sentences, their own sacred rites. They imagine themselves in scenes from pre-Raphaelite paintings, in private Grecian temples waiting for marriage, their own form of hieroskamos. They imitate high culture, slowly embodying what they want to become. Raine, to an extent, is moldable in the image imposed on her by Roland, but nonetheless sees herself as slowly discovering the culture to which she aspired. Katabasis also, then, accompanies initiation and transformation. In Cambridge, though, Raine depicts further descent, and in changing herself, her outer self at least, to suit her surroundings, she finds it harder to extricate herself. She learns to use Cambridge's rhetoric of intellectual honesty, using the flat voice of rationalism, to forget the speech of her native fairyland, which she is accused of living in. The underworld is again a socio-cultural allegory of contemporary life. Describing her disenchantment, she writes that, upon encountering the milieu of Wittgenstein, Bertrand Russell, and Bloomsbury humanism, she discovered that the beauty she had hitherto found in Milton and the Romantics were not of the imagination, but imaginary. Though she says she was not yet able to retort that, if this be so, there is more value in the illusion than the reality. Better to have been moved by a bad poem, a melodramatic or sentimental story, than to have missed the experience of wonder and delight. And discovering the wasteland, she writes, the spiritual state of Ilford, given its enduring expression. And it is also the spiritual state of a generation of atheists, Marxists, Freudians, the rootless who are drawn to the avant-garde. Real life here spills over into poetry. The past becomes myth, and contemporary writers either chronicle or are enfolded within Raine's mythopoesis. Another writer with, like Eliot, the capacity to identify the hell they inhabited at Cambridge was Malcolm Lowry, whom she knew at university, and she described him as a genius in the sense that he possessed, I quote, that gift of access to the universal. So her time at Cambridge spent soaking up ideas of communism, anarchism, and surrealism. She refers to as inhabiting dis, or the hells, and their arts akin to those that enliven Milton's Pandemonium. But she notes that only Malcolm saw the hells for what they were, and in so doing was to be free of them, while she did not recognize she was in hell at all at the time. Virginia Woolf is drawn into the mythic narrative too, though not initially the underworld, when she comes to give a lecture on a room of one's own at Girton. The reception room is imbued with a dreamy unreality. The college is fairyland, and Woolf, with Rita Sackville-West, are, Raine states, the two most beautiful women she had ever seen. And they arrive as if they had descended like goddesses from Olympus, while Woolf has about her an inherited glory shed from the greatness of the writers of the past. But later, her perspective shifts. Raine meets Woolf after being recommended by Julian Bell to run the Hogarth Press, but Woolf has lost the manner of her first impression and looks wan and human instead. Her literary lineage was just a mirage. The difference is always in ways of seeing. The shift from one reality to another is, as Raine observes, Lowry discovering, simply contained in a movement in perspective. The idea of wearing shrouds or masks over one's soul or true identity, while in these hells of spiritual lack, is a central theme throughout Raine's autobiography, and is itself taken from a complex piece of Allegoresis, Porphyry's On the Cave of the Nymphs, an interpretation of a passage from Homer's Odyssey, in which cloth or shroud is the body woven around the soul. And in The Land Unknown, she describes a mask she acquires in Cambridge after eating the pomegranate seed of materialist philosophy and scientific criticism. She develops a thin, brittle new personality and was not at that time anyone or anything except the part. So what then is to be gained from descending to earth or to hell? What does Raine get from framing her story in this way? What does she get for all of her ordeals? David Pike writes that the narrative of descent doesn't change as it's reworked and regenerated, but what is sought and is retrieved does. The Katabasis prompts transformation, answers. Emerging after the descent, Raine is not the same person. She has gained vision. Transformation in the underworld allows her to see beyond the material, beyond the cult of the senses, and leading her to the texts and traditions that have been submerged. She writes, "Perhaps I am now able to speak with more authority on the side of Plato and Plotinus for having lived in and through the other culture." So in seeing clearly and gaining authority, she's able to reject major ways of viewing the world, reorientating itself instead from the perspective of the undercurrent, the hidden, the esoteric. In writing Autobiography, Raine draws modernism, the modernists, into her own mythopoesis and re-establishes the past on her own terms. Thank you.
Thank you for all the insights. I was really interested in the idea. Oh, sorry. I was really interested in the idea of Essex as a kind of modern inferno, because it's interestingly, it's become a part of modern culture. You know, the idea of a kind of fallen world presided over by the David Beckham and his wife.
He's from there, is he?
He's become the embodiment of Essex. I don't know.
Yeah.
I suppose he's at least an honorary member. I was, yes, if I may, I'd like to ask a first question about this, the question of the underworld, because in the Christian tradition, very often the allegories of the experience of the underworld is connected to a personal sense of sin. I was just wondering if you found the same thing.
Yeah,
Kathleen.
that's a very good point. I haven't thought about it too much. I would say no. It seems to be, I'm approaching it from the Greco-Roman side of things, obviously, but for me, I think the term she couches it in is all kind of, it's an inevitable process. It's sort of, like she says, it's her fable, it's her story. Sin is involved. Obviously, she reflects a lot on the things that she's done in her life. But in terms of the overarching narrative, I think I read it as just, something that's kind of fated and always involves this sort of hardship.
Okay. So I was thinking of the pattern of the conversion narrative, where you sort of emphasize, the wrong road you took. Okay. Any questions on the floor?
Thank you very, very much for an extremely thought-provoking paper. I've been sort of rerunning the autobiography through my head ever since you spoke, really, with new facets coming up. I'm wondering what you make of the fact that towards the end, as I remember, fairly late in the story, you get a really extravagant description of Kathleen committing what she feels to be a terrible crime, in that her relationship with Gavin Maxwell ends with her uttering this curse, which she felt destroyed his life and killed him. Does this also fit into some allegorical pattern? It seems to me, just sort of superficially, that this is almost like a different myth intruding or cutting across. It isn't simply a descent followed by a happy return. Something else terrible happens, doesn't it? And how does this fit into the pattern, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's probably another kind of descent into an even lower abyss than anything she's experienced before. I think set into relief by the fact that she feels, you know, her and Maxwell have been brought together by the one mind, and that this is, you know, sort of what she's been put here to accomplish, like their union. Yeah, I think for me, I would read it as, again, still part of this narrative of she's seen something amazing with Gavin, but it was never her lot to go any further with it. You know, she's been given like that kind of glimpse of what's possible when, I guess, you meet your soulmate. And yeah, I mean, maybe that does bring in the question of sin. And I mean, I know her relationship with Catholicism was fraught, but I think it was something she thought about a lot. But yeah, it definitely could bring in other myths and other narratives from there. But yeah, no, that's a really good point. Thank you.
Thank you.
I was just wondering about this idea of katabasis, and you know, there's also the notion of necromancy, when you go down into the underworld and you see, well, there's just one, in fact, occurrence of necromancy, which is Aeneas' descent into the underworld to seek his father. Are there instances of where you go and question the deceased and
in terms of in Raine, or
in Raine, because the
well, I suppose one way of looking at it would be, you know, she goes, for example, to Cambridge to find answers. Like, she thinks she's gonna find answers, find more than what she's had in Ilford. And I suppose that's always the kind of part of the motivation of the soul being drawn away from its origins, is this kind of daring audacity that it thinks that it can find something better than where it's come from. So I'm not sure that, you know, she doesn't find the answers she might have been looking for because she's gone too far from her origins. So I'm not sure it really works in the kind of Aeneid sense of searching for specific answers from, you know, the ghosts or whatever. But I think looking at it from the sense that she's sort of led astray by the wrong search for knowledge into this underworld, when really, you know, she's had everything within her all along. You know, it's been kind of in her soul from the beginning, but without going through that, she doesn't realize, if that makes sense.
Thank you for your presentation. I made me think about Joseph Campbell with the hero of 1,000 faces and the monomyth. That is to say that every myth is connected to this this process of first being dismembered, being fragmented, then going into the underworld and finding the initiation, and then finally resurrecting and going back to the world. And my vision, I don't know if it's yours also, but the poet has to go through a sort of fragmentation to understand how it is to be separated, and to understand finally that we are not separated, that we are whole, that we are part of unity. And because we are in a fragmented world, maybe the poet is here to bring back to this unity. I don't know if it's your vision, but when I've been working on Kathleen Raine, that was also what I felt like. The poet is the one who is remembering, that is to say, when you are dismembered, then you are remembered. And she was there to remember and to bring back to unity. Would you agree with this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, yeah, that's completely right. And I think what Raine views a central task of the poet, restoring the lost wholeness and putting everything back together. And perhaps part of that is, knowing what it's like to be completely torn apart and seeing the other side of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny, for your very interesting talk. It's moving a little bit outside the three memoirs. You mentioned, I think you mentioned India's Sinafar, the final volume, if you like. Did you see anything allegorical in that? It's years since I read it. Would you say that's the point of remembering? Is that the coming together? Is that the culmination point? Or
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, probably. That would make a lot of sense. I mean, I haven't looked at it so much because I feel like, it's not my
yes, of course.
background. But yeah, that would make a lot of sense as kind of the culmination of many decades of searching. Thank you. That's a good point. I think in general as well, I'm just trying to show her the sort of shift in perspective that she brings to the world, which is very subtle and kind of quite hard to grasp because obviously we're not familiar, as the Neoplatonists were, with like, reading multiple levels of meaning into all aspects of life and culture. But yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you. So, thank you very much.